Thanks everyone for joining us for today's Conversations with Economists webinar. Today we're going to be talking about Is College Worth It?, which I'm sure will be very interesting to many of you. My name is Bianca. I'm from the BU Alumni Association. And just really quickly, if you want to keep up to date with other events that are going on with the Alumni Association, please join us at bu.edu/alumni. The Q&A function will be available throughout the webinar, so please feel free to utilize that and ask questions as we go. And that's all. I'm not going to monopolize your time. I'm going to pass it over to Josh so we can get started. Thanks, everyone.
Great. But I think I'm going to pass it to James, who might actually really get us started.
Excellent. And yeah. So I'll be your humble moderator for today. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much, Bianca. So I think most of us here in the webinar at some point made a bet on college. We had this idea that we would do this big time investment, money investment in going to college, possibly BU for many of you, and thought that this would pay off. And so the question we're asking today is, what about the future? This question of is college worth it? It's certainly gotten louder and louder in the last couple of years. This isn't just a story about generative AI, but obviously the fact that a computer can do a lot of things that we thought college graduates were sort of uniquely skilled at doing or uniquely qualified to do, certainly makes the question much more urgent. And really, I think we're going to, at least I'm going to try to push Josh and Kevin on today. I think there's a bunch of different questions at one, right? Is college worth it? Is it worth it? And for whom? Compared to doing what else? And is college worth it because of what it teaches you or because of something else you get out of college or somebody else gets out of you going to college? And of course, the question is going to be, has this changed over time? And so we're going to try to pull these apart today. I'm James Feigenbaum. I'm an assistant professor in the economics department. I'm mostly an economic historian. And so I feel really, really well qualified to tell you whether or not college was worth it 100 years ago. But I don't think that's maybe the question we're super excited about asking today. I've done some work on returns to education in 1940 and returns to education in the early 20th century. But mostly I'm going to try to get out of the way and let our real experts, Josh Goodman and Kevin Lang, answer this question. So I'll do brief intros for the two of them, and then I'll start asking some questions. Joining me is Josh Goodman. So Josh is an associate professor of education and economics at BU. He's one of the leading applied economists working at sort of the education policy space in the country. He's got work all across the education area, college access, financial aid, online education, long-run effects of high schools. He was previously at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and in particular working on sort of education policy there. And then also joining us is Kevin Lang, who's in the office right next to me, although I'm not in right here. I can tell he is. He's the Laurence A. Professor of Economics at BU. And Kevin has spent his career working on labor economics, questions of the return to education, how labor markets work, discrimination, the value of educational degrees. He's allegedly the author of over 100 academic articles, books, papers. His CV is voluminous, and it crashed my computer when I tried to download it. And so very excited to sort of ask the two of you a bunch of questions about college and whether it's worth it. I should say we've got the Q&A system open. We'll be doing some monitoring of questions. I'll start with sort of some questions I prepared for Josh and Kevin, but I'm eager to get audience participation also, and I'll throw those questions to Josh and Kevin a little later. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking, and hopefully that'll be the most you hear from me today. And let me start with the first question I wanted to ask, and I'll start with Josh and then maybe pivot to Kevin after. So this big question of, is college worth it? I thought maybe we'd make it smaller and ask a simpler question first. So is college worth it? And who is it worth it for? Like, how do you think about those different aspects of who are the people getting value out of college? Josh?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of the things that's triggered this conversation is that we see there's been a lot of attention in the media, particularly in the last couple of years, that suggests that Americans are losing faith in the value of a college degree. There's a lot of survey evidence that says that is true. It's actually that slide has been going on for maybe a decade or so. But on the other hand, that slide doesn't seem to match a lot of the numbers we see. And so it's worth thinking about this a little bit. And so some of the numbers that for example, don't match up with that it still seems like people who earn college degrees substantially out earn people who don't have college degrees. And when I say substantially, something on the order of somewhere between 60 and 80% over the course of a lifetime, which is a really substantial number. Uh, there's also been a lot of concern about the rising costs of four-year college, and people saying that one of the things that might make college not worth it is not just the return on the end, but the cost you have to pay up front. But it also turns out that actually college, though it had gotten much more expensive relative to a generation ago, my mother talks about how she paid her way through SUNY Binghamton by waitressing in the summers, and that might be harder to do now than it was then. Every indication we have says in the last decade or so, after a really rapid rise in the price of college, that has actually flattened out and maybe even started to decline. So the average student is now paying less to go to college than they would have been in inflation adjusted terms about 10 years ago. And so all of this stuff points to the sort of basic numbers we see out there suggesting that college really does seem to pay off on average for the majority of students. There are a lot of caveats. There are some colleges that are higher quality than other colleges. There are some majors that are higher quality than other majors. There are some students who perhaps are, do well in college and others who don't. So I'm happy to have sort of longer conversations about that. But I think the big picture headline that I sort of take away from looking at all this stuff is that, yeah, college does pay off for the most part.
Yeah. Kevin, do you have a general agreement, general disagreement?
I mean, I'm generally in agreement, obviously, but I think it's the for whom part of your question is really important. And of course, we can look at extreme situations. It probably was a good idea for Mick Jagger not to finish his master's degree at the LSE. We know that Bill Gates probably didn't, make a big mistake by not finishing his BA. But it's also true for people who just have talents that do not rely on the set of cognitive and social skills that are acquired in college. In particular, people who may have strong manual skills that are not, at the same time, do not have the kind of cognitive skills that help you succeed in college. They're probably hurt, right? They're probably better off getting the appropriate training over 2 to 4 years to become, a skilled worker in some particular trade. But if we're talking about, take a random kid, I don't know anything about them. Yes, the benefit I think is still clearly there.
So a question I have sort of, maybe this is coming from an economic history perspective. So the person on the margin of making this decision is 18 right now, or 16 or 17, like thinking about college soon. Josh, when you answered your question before about the numbers that we have, like those are stories about, I guess the costs are sort of contemporary data, and so we're sort of up to date on the cost side. But the return side, like we have good evidence for a decade ago kids or 20 years ago kids, or like how should we think about, in a fast moving world, how sort of confident or not confident we are in what we would expect about the return to college 10 years from now or 20 years from now?
Yeah, this is a great question. Obviously, it's one that's come up a lot with the rise of generative AI and sort of concerns that the things that we think that colleges are helping students with or developing those cognitive skills as higher order thinking skills, if those are things that generative AI can replace potentially, maybe the return to a college degree goes down. That certainly is possible. And there's been a lot of concern over the fact, and this is an interesting thing, that in the last few years, in the last really 3 years, I think, the unemployment rate of sort of young college graduates has been historically high in a way that coincides with the timing of the release of ChatGPT and has people worried. And so there's been a lot of discussion about maybe this is we're sort of seeing the end of the value of a college degree. But I am increasingly convinced that that's a misreading of the evidence, at least for now. I'll make a plug. Derek Thompson has a great podcast called Plain English, and a few episodes ago he had on a writer for The Atlantic who did a great job of explaining that it's true that the unemployment rate for recent college grads has been historically a bit high, but actually it turns out it's not unique to college grads. Young people in general are sort of stuck in a difficult labor market. The only reason that non-college grads unemployment rate looks any better relative to historical terms is that a lot of them have dropped out of the labor force entirely due to discouragement. And if you really looked at all this, this is really a story about young people struggling to enter a labor market that's a little bit frozen. But even conditional on that, the ones with college degrees are still better off. So I think it's worth paying attention to these sort of questions about whether, what AI will do to the labor market. But I think the evidence we have still suggests that again, as Kevin said, for people where their sort of cognitive skills are probably going to be their comparative advantage, that college still seems to be paying off.
So if we take a jump back from there's the students themselves and I guess their family footing the bill or whoever's sort of paying for college, but there's also kind of the rest of us. There's sort of like the social gains of going to college. I guess I don't just mean the professors because we like to be employed, so definitely people should go to college and continue to demand lectures from us. But like, is there reason to think that sort of the I guess spillover effects, the more people have college degrees and that's better for everybody else for some reason? Is there reason to think those returns, the sort of social returns to college, that those are changing? Or are we confident they're as big as they ever have been?
The social, I'm going to use social slightly differently from the way you used it.
Please, yeah.
Not just the benefits to other people. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think anybody really has a crystal ball about what AI is going to do yet. Maybe I should have asked ChatGPT, but I'm not sure I trust its answer. But I think, a reasonable response to what's going on now is that cognitive skills are going to decline in importance, right? Social skills, emotional skills are going to increase. College, I think, is actually a very important place for developing those as well. Right? It's especially colleges that are residential, but even non-residential colleges. And so I think one response is that, yes, we've already actually seen that, right? At many of the elite institutions, seems like everybody gets an A. That's not true at BU, but it's true at a lot of places. And so what are students focusing on? They're focusing on showing their leadership, developing their leadership skills. They're taking summer jobs that will help them prepare for the workforce, internships and the like. And the other thing I would say is that if we've learned anything from the rapid pace of technological advance, is that a narrow technical education is very risky. Right? 50 years ago, maybe actually 60 by now, learning to be a skilled typographer looked like a really good path, right? And right now everybody's saying, well, plumbers aren't going to be replaced. Maybe they won't be. Probably they won't be. But what a good education does is teaches you how to learn. And so to the extent that we are going to have to adapt, or maybe I should say my children and grandchildren are going to have to adapt, I guess I'm okay. The value of education is still there.
The adaptability being sort of a key dimension. So let me ask, this is sort of related to something you just said about, not at BU because we have standards, but everywhere else, everyone's just getting A's. So, when we think about the value of college, part of it, of course, is, in the labor market, right? An employer sees your Boston University BA on a resume or a BA from some other lesser institution. What are they really buying? Are they buying the skills that person has learned in college? Are they buying a stamp that said this person managed to finish their college degree? Sort of how do we think about how these, let's say there is a lot of value in a BU degree, how does that value manifest itself, or where does it come from? And how much do we know about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I used to be more sympathetic to the idea that the degree's value was to sort of signal that I'm just a smart person to begin with. I, as I've gotten older and sort of read more research and maybe, I don't know, maybe older and wiser, I'm not sure. I've actually come around more to the view that most, if not all of the value of the degree is about the skills that are conferred during the education. Um, I'll just give you two examples that from research that I sort of, or from data that sort of helped me get there. One is we know that there are really different returns to different college majors, even among students who appear to sort of start with the same rough set of skills. And so you take two identical students, you send them into different college majors, even though they might end up with a degree from the same institution, the specific field in which they're trained make the big difference to their career outcomes. And that suggests to me that it really is something about the skills that are being taught in classes. The other is a great paper that I teach in one of my classes from the country of Colombia, but I suspect the lesson applies here too, which is a professor who's now at the University of Toronto, Carolina Arteaga, found this fascinating natural experiment where the most elite university in Colombia said to its economics majors, in order to get your economics BA, you used to have to complete some number of credits, but now you can actually get this BA by completing about 2/3 of those. So all these students are getting the same BA, the same field from the same institution. They're getting an economics degree from this elite institution. And what she finds is that the students who didn't need to complete as many courses ended up getting substantially worse jobs than the prior cohorts who had been asked to complete substantially more coursework. In other words, same students to begin with, same major, but they were graduating having done fewer courses that presumably gave them some skills that employers valued. And so all that convinces me that at least a chunk of what is valuable about the degree is actually what experiences students are having in their courses and on campus.
So I'm of course on record arguing that an important fraction of the benefit of the education is signaling something about yourself, your cognitive skills, you're willing to sit through boring classes while I'm droning on in the lectures, whatever it is. Now, when I find myself arguing with people about this, it usually comes down to them saying, well, it's only about a third of the benefit is due to those signals that you're talking about. Whereas, my position is it's like fully 33%. I think it's more an issue of how important do you think that 1/3 is, rather than a real disagreement about the two roles. I mean, I really would like to think that students who take my classes learn something, and I'm pretty convinced that they do, and that those skills will be helpful to them throughout their lives. But on the other hand, the fact that they got into BU, they got through the program, they got through a very rigorous economics program, is information for an employer who's looking at people who are just entering the labor market. By the time they've been there for something on the order of 7 to 10 years, the market's figured out whether they just managed to get through BU by faking it or whether they're really good. But those initial years matter, right? We're talking, that's when you're trying to pay off your student loans if you have any. That's when you're trying to build up a nest egg to buy the house and all that. And so there's a big return.
And so how do we
I'll also
think...
add,
Oh,
can I just add one other thought, which is I think I really appreciate Kevin's point, and I think that sort of signaling value of, hey, this degree sort of signifies that I'm a certain kind of person who can do certain kinds of things. That is particularly, I think, important for students whom the labor market might otherwise dismiss. So I think for students who have been historically discriminated against, the signaling value of that degree can be particularly valuable early on before the market has figured out exactly what a person knows. It can really be helpful to such students.
And so if we think about the sort of that idea that the sort of the BU diploma or any diploma sort of confers something, I guess the natural question, and I'll steal this from Matt Rothman, who's one of our participants, said in the chat, 2-year college, 4-year college versus getting 10 AWS or Azure cloud certificates. I think I said Azure, right, which is a signal of my own nerdiness, or some other alternative. So I guess the question there is like, if we think there's some role for like, a diploma says something about me, then should we ask whether it's the diploma from a 4-year BA, 4-year residential BA, 4-year private school like BU, or from a state school, from a 2-year college, or the sort of more specific like micro degrees or micro certificates that again signal something very specific, a very specific set of skills. Like how should we think about the sort of value of these different things, and do they, how much do we know about that, and how much do they sort of inform these answers?
So I don't. I think what we have is pieces of evidence from different studies, none of which encompass all of these things, but which sort of allow you to put together a chain of comparisons. And I would describe my take on the results as basically saying that more education is better. In other words, if you're a student at the end of high school and your choice is, do I stop here or do I go to a 2-year college? On average, going to the 2-year college pays off. If you're thinking about, should I go to a 2-year college or a 4-year college, and you're on that margin, it seems like on average, going to the 4-year college pays off more than the 2-year college. Same thing on average with these certificates, which is to say they are generally shorter term educational experiences than a 2-year college degree, and they tend to pay off less than an associate's degree, a 2-year degree. So I think very roughly on average, in some sense, you get what you work for or you pay for, which is the more education you do, the more it pays off.
So I added a few things. First of all, there's been a big increase in the United States in licensing requirements. And so in some cases, certification, and that may be an associate's degree, that may be a bachelor's degree, that may be a certificate, is just a pathway to getting the job. You can't do it, right? In Massachusetts, you can't even legally do your own plumbing repairs unless you have a plumber's license. I'm not saying nobody does, but you can't.
I promise, I definitely do not.
And there's tremendous variation, even in terms of certificates, associate's degrees, and as Josh has already marked, in terms of bachelor's degrees. Some certificates from 2-year colleges, I think, are worth about as much as the paper they're written on. Others are very valuable. To get an associate's degree as a registered nurse is very valuable. There's some value in the certification to be a licensed practical nurse. I think the evidence is a 2-year liberal arts degree from a community college is not worth very much unless you go on and use it as the basis for going on to do a bachelor's degree at a 4-year institution. And to some extent, we haven't talked about this. The same story, not nearly as extreme, is that the 4-year bachelor's degree is a pathway to further education that is itself a pathway into highly remunerative professions.
So,
by the way, all of this makes clear that it's not clear that we're disinterested observers here. Like it's in our economic interest to tell people to come to college, but
yes, and to come to
I feel okay about that based on the research evidence.
Yes, yeah. No, I think that rings true. Okay, so at the level of these questions of like you're talking to a student or a potential student, and they're wondering like which dimension, maybe this is the question of what major to do, maybe this is a question of to go to trade school or to go to a community college or go to a 4-year school, or sort of like the specific path of which of these micro degree, micro programs to do, which kind of an apprenticeship. Like how do we think about who goes where? Like, do we have any sense of how to make these matches or make these matches better? Because it seems like there's some cost to showing up at the wrong kind of school or to choosing the wrong major. And is that a question that's sort of universal? There are just good and bad majors, or is that a question that's sort of more specific to the person? Do we have any way of thinking about that?
I think it's a great question because sort of implicit in that, or I don't know if implicit in that question, but implicit in some of at least my comments earlier is the notion that the payoff to education tends to come from completing the degree, right? So
Yeah.
when we look at the students, for example, who are struggling with paying back student loans, it tends to be the people who started their education but didn't finish and sort of incurred some debt along the way, but then didn't end up with the job that would allow them to pay that off.
Yeah.
So I think you're right that it's important. We want to set up systems that do a good job of matching students to the right degrees and institutions. And I think our system is okay at that right now, but it's not totally clear to me that we are very systematic about that. The U.S. runs a substantially more decentralized higher education admissions system than most countries on Earth do, where a lot of this stuff is run through, literally an algorithm that the central government runs based on your test scores and your grades to assign you to institutions. I'll just give you one example of a piece of research I saw this weekend, just 2 days ago at a Society of Labor Economics conference. There's a set of colleges called for-profit colleges, which are run as for-profit businesses. They tend to compete with community colleges for a set of students who are, on average, academically less strong than four-year students are. And the common wisdom for a while, and which I have shared, has been that the for-profit colleges have very bad outcomes relative to other college sectors, including two-year institutions. And there's been a lot of push to regulate them more heavily, including from the Biden administration when I was working there. I saw a PhD student from Yale present a paper at this conference saying it's true that the for-profit institutions look a lot worse along many dimensions, but actually there's a difference between how they're serving the middle of the skill distribution, where community colleges do a much better job of serving those students, versus the really bottom of the skill distribution, where it turns out the for-profit colleges might be doing a better job with those students, sort of tailoring their programs to things that have sort of no liberal arts components or no sort of math requirements or nothing that will get in the way of graduating. And so really broadly, I think you're absolutely right. We want to think about how to match people to the institutions where they will succeed, because that's clearly very important.
So I'm largely going to repeat what Josh said, but put it a little bit differently. I mean, one of the good things about the U.S. education system is it's much more forgiving than many of the education systems elsewhere in the world, right? So if you're in, say, the United Kingdom, you apply for a very narrow degree. You are going to study chemistry and only the things that you need for chemistry, right? And if you wake up in your second year of university in the middle of a 3-year degree and say, I've been talking to people who are studying economics, and I really wish I was studying economics, but you haven't, even in your secondary school, haven't taken the courses that you would need to apply to economics. You may have to go back for a year to secondary school and then completely, if you're successful getting admitted, complete a completely new program. And of course, people don't do that. And so if they find they're mismatched on the subject area, that's a real problem. I do want to emphasize the other point that Josh made, which is the importance of completing, right? That the people who really lose are the ones who acquire a lot of debt and do not complete their programs. And the research that I did found that completing a program in a for-profit or in a community college had about, conditional on the subject area you were studying, had about the same benefits, regardless of whether it was for-profit or a public two-year institution. But I think what we do know is that the debt you leave a for-profit institution with, if you fail to complete, is much higher, and that's really where the problems arise with the for-profits.
Yeah, the two sides of the ledger, right? Is college worth it? Is not just a question about the return, but also the cost to get there. Okay, so this is a question. I'll grab this from the queue. So Michael Dannenberg is sort of understood. There's this college degree completion premium, right? As we kind of know about that. But if we go back to this question about what are our students actually learning, so hopefully they're learning something. There's some conferral of knowledge. How do we know if the net prices of college charging are sort of worth it in terms of this knowledge acquired? How do colleges improve knowledge acquisition to make it more worth it? And I'll ask with a very specific spin that I'm curious about from you two as practitioners in this space, as teachers yourselves. How are we sort of meeting this moment of generative AI and LLMs and Claude and ChatGPT can do our problem sets and our homework for us, and so that's, I guess, they can do our students' work for them. How are you guys thinking about your teaching changing or evolving in ways that you're like, it used to be enough to assign a problem. We would sort of assume that the knowledge from the problem set would be somehow deposited into our students' heads, or they'd take an exam with us and then the knowledge would be there afterwards. How are you thinking about sort of the building of human capital, the building of skills, the building of the attainment of knowledge among our students in this very new learning landscape?
I'm happy to start with sort of two thoughts because I love Michael's question. I think it's very hard to think about measuring the knowledge that is actually being learned on college campuses. There are countries that do exit exams for college students in the same way that we have something like an entrance exam, like the SAT or AP exams. Again, I sort of think that our system is probably too decentralized and fragmented to get anyone to agree to such a thing. And I'll just give you one little personal anecdote. I have my oldest child's in 10th grade, and so probably next year we're going to start going to colleges. And we started talking about, like, what are you going to look for when you're on a college campus? And I said to him, like, you're going to look at the weather and you're going to enjoy the campus, but you are not going to be able to tell from that campus visit the quality of the teaching. It's just not a thing you can observe. And you sort of have to have, I think, some kind of faith based on the school's reputation and the outcomes of its recent graduates, what's going to happen there. So I find it a frustrating, a good question, but I don't have a satisfying answer. In terms of the AI stuff, and I'd love to hear Kevin's thoughts on this, I've certainly been struggling with that. I mean, an obvious reaction I think a lot of us have had is to downweight the assignments, the value of the assignments we give students to do at home, and upweight the things that we can observe them doing in class, like presentations and exams. But I guess I have a little bit of faith that most of the faculty around me are here because they're genuinely interested in teaching and getting students to learn. And so I sort of think it's a little messy, but we're all figuring it out, and we will get there in the end somehow.
Yeah, I don't have the magic bullet for AI. I do think, as I said earlier, that AI is going to change the set of skills that people need in the labor market, right? And it's going to be increasingly social skills. That's a trend that's been going on for 20 years. And I think we have increasingly changed the way we teach to help build those skills, right? And I think we're going to do more of that. So, early in my career, I never would have even considered the possibility of assigning a group project, right? And now I do it with my PhD students, right? And so I think that's changed dramatically. I think you see it in Questrom. I expect you see it in Wheelock as well. So that's one change. Another change in terms of dealing with AI itself is obviously that we do more of the evaluation in class and less of the evaluation outside of class, right? So we might not even bother grading problem sets any longer. I don't have a magic bullet for that. There was another point, but it has slipped. Oh, yes, we were talking about how do we evaluate what people learn?
Yeah.
That's been a challenge for high school, right? I mean, the states in the US and in other countries have been trying to do that. It is much harder to evaluate the things you really want to know whether they've learned, right? Which is not, who won World War II and who came second, but how to think about the evidence around those causes of World War II and how to draw conclusions and maybe even come up with some new ideas. And that is just very expensive to test. And it gets even harder when you get to the college level where not everybody is taking algebra and geometry. And so, I don't have a solution for that.
Excellent, excellent. So okay, I'm gonna grab one more from another from the chat that I really liked. It's well. So Perry Grossman wrote in. He said, "Funny thing, I graduated from McGill in Canada. I did not go to the ceremony. They mailed the diploma to me in the U.S. and it was declared for customs purposes diploma of no commercial value. So at least we have some evidence that at least some parts of the government thinks that college degrees are worthless. So I guess." But maybe if there's the commercial value is questionable, this sort of gets into another question I wanted to ask, which is, we're focusing on the return to college in terms of wages and earnings and money and sort of stuff because we're economists that we like to measure, but also things that we are good at measuring usually. Obviously, the return to college, the question of is college worth it? You could imagine a lot of other sort of Y variables, outcome variables we could sort of ask about. Effects of college on your social network, on who you are as a person, on who you marry, or your civic life, or your happiness. What do we know about that? What do we know about changes in that, trends in that? I assume that everyone who goes to BU ends up much happier and a nicer, more well-rounded person. But like, what does the data tell us, or what do we think the literature tells us?
And
going
taller.
forward,
If you go to college, you end up taller. No, I think that's probably not true. I think we do have pretty good evidence on some of these domains that college changes things beyond just economic outcomes. I mean, a really obvious one is it absolutely changes who you marry. I'm a data point of a sample size of one on that. I met my wife my second year of college, and I wouldn't have met her had I not gone to college. I actually think there's a really interesting recent, in the last just 3 or 4 years, I've started to see a really interesting set of papers by people trying to very carefully answer the question, how does college change sort of political engagement, both the sort of level of engagement, are you more likely to be a voter, for example, but also, what are your political leanings? And I think we are beginning to have some evidence that college can certainly change levels of political engagement, and may also change your personal politics. I do think we're in a moment in this country where I certainly wish that more people had a more extensive education and a grasp of history that college would have helped some people with. I'll stop there and say, yeah, there are a lot of other domains that I think higher education likely improves, including, I think, mortality, right? Like the length of your life will be longer if you go to college. And I'm pretty confident that there's a causal component to that, not just a selection issue.
And so I guess a follow-up, like if we're narrowly focused on just like the accounting exercise of like, is college worth it? How do we get all that other stuff into that equation?
It's a great question. I'll give you my sort of cop-out answer, which is I don't know if we need to, because even without all those other things that you might describe as benefits, people live longer, more likely to be married, happily married. I think most of the kind of calculations we do suggest that even without all that stuff, if you just focus on the narrow economic returns to college, that you can justify most of the public investments that we do in that sector already. And so maybe what it tells us is that we're still under investing in some ways because there are these other benefits we don't tend to account for in our calculations. But I'm not sure if it flips the sign of the message that college is worth it.
Right.
So I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Daniele Passerman's research that shows that studying economics makes you more sexist. So it's not there. I don't want to claim everything's positive. I do agree with Josh. I think that by and large, the evidence is the social benefits, by which I mean not the benefits to you socially, but the benefits that accrue to other people from your education are generally positive. Let me stop there. I think Josh gave a very good answer.
Excellent. So I have another I'm curious to see if you'll both dodge this, but an interesting question from the chat that I'll throw out there. So David Fasano, whose name I'm almost certainly pronouncing wrong, apologies. So is college worth it? If so, we get this like increasingly negative public perception, right? If there's a steady drumbeat of like college isn't worth it, college is overpriced, blah blah blah. Like, how do we as Boston University, or as I guess humble professors within Boston University, or sort of affiliates of other such similar institutions, how does this sort of like, how does this affect us, right? What are we doing, if anything, to sort of counter this idea that suddenly college is no longer worth it, that you can, I don't know, get a Claude to tutor you for a couple hours a night, and suddenly you've learned all you would have learned from a 4-year degree.
Kevin, do you want to start? I'm happy to.
Sure. I mean, I think, from the perspective of Boston University itself, I think the most important thing is to have a set of alumni who believe they got something out of coming here. And certainly, the experience that my daughters had who were not at Boston University was, I think, that their career paths were very much affected by the choices of the colleges that they made. So in that sense, I think we're corrected. I think the bigger problem is that despite what Josh said earlier about the net cost of college having not gone up and if anything declined in recent years after a big, huge increase earlier, the fact that the sticker price keeps rising and rising faster than inflation does cause a serious image problem for universities. And it would be very costly to stop doing that, because frankly, what universities are doing are exploiting the very large increase in inequality. That means that there are a set of households out there that can pay very high prices for university, while using those high prices to offset the tuition costs of people who are not in that very elite economic group. But on the other hand, if there was some way we could get across the message, hey, it's really not as expensive as we've been telling you, it would make a difference.
Yeah, I'll say three things. One is, sort of putting my economist hat on. Even if in surveys people express a lot of doubts about the value of higher education, they are not behaving like it. In other words, people are still going to 4-year college at very high rates. And there's not really any evidence that has slowed down. It turns out, Kevin, as a minor correction, even the sticker price of college has declined in the last 10 years, although it is still extremely high in ways that certainly give me, as a parent of 3 adolescents, some anxiety at night. So,
and 2 of them are twins, folks. So it's going to be,
and 2 of them are twins. So that's really going to be a problem when that hits. So like, point is totally taken that there's still scary large numbers being thrown around, at least in the private sector. And then the third thing is that I'll take my economist hat off a little bit and put on my just sort of amateur social scientist hat, political scientist hat. I think some of the declines that we're seeing in surveys about faith in the value of higher education are basically almost entirely driven by people who are self-described conservatives politically. And so there's a really interesting political dimension to this, which is I think that a set of people are receiving messages from whatever media or social networks they get information from that are telling them that higher education is not valuable or to be trusted anymore. And that message is landing very differently depending on what one's political leanings are. And so I think it's somewhat important to sort of think about the distinction between sort of the cold hard economic fact and the fact that people still do seem to think that by their behavior that 4-year college matters, versus the sort of survey evidence that suggests that something funny is happening in terms of the politics of higher education, which I think is a little separate from the economic return issue.
And so it may be too fast to have seen this, but like, is there evidence in the data that there's a sort of a political bifurcation in who's applying to college or going to college, or is this like this lack of faith doesn't actually ever translate to numbers?
That's a great question. I don't think I've seen evidence on that question at all. The one thing that I have seen evidence on, which worries me, but is a little different from what you asked, is there's a set of researchers, Riley Acton, Emily Cook, and Paula Ugalde, who recently wrote a paper showing that college campuses are becoming increasingly polarized. In other words, it seems like students are selecting to go to colleges more and more with other students whose politics matches them to begin with, in a way that wasn't true 30 years ago. So there is something to people sort of seeing campuses through a political lens, but it's not clear that that means that any particular type of student is being steered away from the college experience broadly. They may just be sort of moving towards specific colleges where they think they will be at home politically.
I seem to remember somebody writing about political polarization geographically, whether polarization has increased. That sound familiar, James?
A little bit, yeah. So I have some work on. I'm the moderator, not the talent here. No,
you're allowed to talk about your.
This is work with a former graduate student of ours, Ron Kevin's, where we were trying to parse between these questions of polarization, not from an education perspective, but basically like, essentially, how easy is it to predict someone's politics given a bunch of information about them, given their demographic variables, given, we know their age, we know where they live, we know their education, and maybe some other information. The short answer to that is it's kind of, we've always been pretty our politics had never been that hidden. If I tell you a lot about somebody, but I don't tell you what party they're in, you can do a pretty good job of predicting it today, but you can also do a pretty good job of predicting it historically. And so to some extent, this question of like, I guess maybe there's more op-ed columnists who are worried about this polarization thing getting worse and worse. But at least the data doesn't speak to a brand new, totally new trend. I've got a really good question in the queue from Barry Levine, who asks a couple, but I want to focus on just one. And again, this comes back a little bit to us, both as economists and researchers, but also as professors. So Barry sort of speculates that part of the problem is that our institutions just aren't really keeping pace with society and technology. We're sort of maybe idolizing some kind of classic idea of education. Barry says when he was in secondary school, students weren't allowed to use calculators, or even in the early college courses, right? There was this, I remember that, I personally remember, but I've read of the sort of moral panic that came with the calculator. Students aren't going to learn division and multiplication by hand because they're just going to punch it into a calculator. Do we think that like generative AI and ChatGPT, like, are these just the calculator of this generation? And so I guess the question that Barry ends with is shouldn't we be teaching people how to use the tools as opposed to like figuring out how to structure our work around that? I mean, this is something I've worried about. So I teach this big undergraduate class, and I had this assignment where I give the students, I basically tell them to do the first day of a new research project, right? Just come up with a cool question and figure out why that question's interesting. And when I taught this class in 2022 or 2023, the sort of beginning of ChatGPT, it couldn't do it. Like, you could give it this open prompt and it would just fail miserably. It would ask terrible questions. I'm kind of sure that like this semester when I taught last fall, I don't know how many students were asking ChatGPT to help, but like if I give it the prompt, it does pretty well. And so I guess one version of this is I just stop using that question, or I make them do it in class in an exam setting where I see their little hands actually writing. And another version is somehow figure out how to make this into a module that helps them learn to use the tools. So I guess a question for you two is how do we think about, in our instruction or our pedagogy in terms of these new tools, or should we be teaching people to use the tools, or are we not qualified to do it? I don't know I'm not quite sure where to land.
Okay, so I think there's very quickly going to be a generation for whom this is just everyday life, right? And so I don't think we're going to have to teach them how to use the tool, but I think we're going to have to teach them how to be smart consumers, right? In the same way, right, we had to teach, the internet came along. It was an exciting, shiny new toy, right? And I don't think anybody in this day and age would say, well, you shouldn't be allowed to Google information, right? You shouldn't be able to use the internet to find data sets or articles on the topic. But we also needed to teach them that not everything you see on the internet is true. And, right now, AI still makes up stuff, gets it wrong. And they have to learn to be smart consumers of it. And we have to also figure out the difference between what's a shiny new toy, right? And what is really helpful, right? So, I remember when, the school system spent quite a lot of time teaching kids how to do a PowerPoint presentation, and people thought it was just such a wonderful thing. And I don't think that's a particularly useful thing that you want to teach in school. Most of us can figure out how to do a PowerPoint presentation on our own. So we're going to be behind. I mean, in response to the question, look how long it took us to get away from talk and chalk lectures, right? We haven't completely got away from them, but we have made a lot of progress getting away from them, right? We're going to be slow. That's the truth. We were slow with the internet. We were slow with calculators. You can look back and find, people being concerned about students using pen and paper, instead of their slate and chalk. Or when I first moved to England, you had to write your exam in an old old style pen. You couldn't use a ballpoint pen. You had to use a fountain pen, right? For what reason, I have no idea. It was just, the conservative approach. Yeah, we're going to be behind the times. Let's face it. You guys are younger than I am, but still, we're kind of set in our ways, and it'll take a while to. We'll, I don't do things the way I did them 50 years ago, but I don't change as quickly as the world does.
So I'll say, so I'm someone who I force my students. I don't allow laptops or phones or any kind of electronics in my classes, and I force my students to take notes by hand. So in some ways, I'm very old school. I think there's some good evidence about that. But I also find this challenge of what to do with AI and these kind of tools in the classroom. I find it very difficult to navigate because I'm completely sympathetic to the view that these tools are out there and we want people to be able to use them, and they're really powerful at making us more powerful in the same way that Google, and the internet helps us. The challenge I have is, someone once said that there are certain kind of tasks that when you use AI for, it's like bringing a forklift to the gym. The weights get lifted, but you don't get any stronger. And I think that's the real challenge for us as teachers, is how to strike that balance of making sure that we're actually forcing our students to exercise their brain muscles while not being total Luddites and saying, use of AI must be sort of completely walled off from this course. And I think that's a really hard balance to strike in a class. And I'll just sort of end this little thought by saying, given that the theme of this session is there, what is college worth it? My prediction is that AI is one of these tools where you're going to have to train people to use it effectively. It will make them more effective at certain kinds of jobs. And I will predict that it's going to be a lot better to be someone who goes to college and learns a whole bunch of stuff, including how to use these tools in the context of the various skills we're trying to teach, than to be someone who never experiences college and might struggle to get that experience otherwise. So I'd rather my kids have that college degree because I think it will better equip them to deal with that brave new world we're in.
So that's a perfect. So I've never in my life finished a lecture on time. I always am running over. My students are holding up their book. So we have 4 minutes. So I'm trying to stay aware of that. So I want to pivot to our sort of concluding question. So I had written down, to ask you guys if your friend's kid or Josh, I guess in your case, one of your kids came up to you and said, tomorrow, should I go to college? I guess the question is, what would you tell them, and how much would that answer depend on who the kid is or what kind of college? And I'll add in a question that we had in the chat from Mitchell Goldstein, which is, it's very similar. How do parents advise their children when looking at colleges to know whether a specific college is worth the overall cost? And I guess maybe embedded in there is how much do we know that overall cost is the actual cost? But so what presumably you guys have people coming up to you all the time, I guess, asking, should little so and so go to college, and where and why, and how do you think about that answer?
I think a very good first question to ask is, like, tell me about your kid and what their skills and interests are. And if it's, because this is not just many people are not choosing, am I going to college? Am I not going to college? It's usually something like, what type of thing am I going to go do? Am I going to go work? Am I going to go do some kind of training that is not college? Am I going to go do college? If so, is it a 2-year? Is it a 4-year? Is it an elite one? Is it a less elite one? So I think this is less a question of college or no versus like, what's the plan for putting you on some kind of career path that's helpful. And I think I think if your kid is a strong student and sort of enjoys school environments generally, then it's likely that college is going to be the right path for them. If they have gotten to the end of high school and they say, please God, don't ever do that to me again, or they just express very clear interest in some domain that traditional colleges don't train us in, I think that's the point at which you might consider alternatives. And then lastly, to this question of how to advise about specific colleges, I think that's really tricky. I think it is really worth paying attention to what a given college's historical record has been about. The simplest thing to look at is what fraction of kids actually successfully graduate from that college. If that number is low, you should be wary. You can get more detailed info. There are websites like the College Scorecard that will tell you what is the average amount that a graduate or a student that started at this institution earns 10 years down the road, if you really want to go the route of trying to do some complicated calculations. But I do think graduation rates are not terrible proxy for whether a school is doing well by its students.
I'll just add one more thing on the advice. I think we probably overestimate the importance of fine distinctions, right? So I'm not talking about, very elite versus non-flagship state college, but I think most places you want to find something that's a size that you feel comfortable with. If you're going to get lost in a big university, you should go to a smaller place. If you want a wider range of opportunities, you're going to go to a larger place. Once you've figured that out, right, I think it won't make a lot of difference whether you go to Michigan or Berkeley, or, you will adapt, you will find friends, you will find programs, whether you go to Boston College or Boston University. And so to focus on,
I think Boston University.
Okay, I'll bear that in mind, never having been a student at either. But you will adapt. You'll have a different experience if you go to those two places, but you will find friends, you will find programs, right? And so it's really, I think, figure out the class of institution that you want to go to, right? Rather than whether on the day you visited, you saw some people playing Frisbee and you like to play Frisbee.
Excellent. Okay, so we've hit 1:30, and so I hope after this hour we can all feel pretty confident in our answer to whether or not college is worth it. And even if you can't necessarily feel confident in that answer, hopefully you can all answer the question of, was this hour spent with us worth it? I think the answer to that is obviously yes. And so I want to thank everybody for tuning in.
Thanks, James, for moderating this.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for your wisdom. And thank you all for tuning in. And thanks to everybody who had questions. I got to most of them, but not all, but they were all of your questions were excellent.